Sister lied about an emergency to dump her kids on me. Turns out she was at a child-free wedding hiding her kids from her boyfriend. Hey everyone, I've been lurking around on Reddit for quite a while now, just quietly reading everyone else's stories. Honestly, I've never been the type to put my own life out there, but today, I feel like I need to get something off my chest. So, here goes. Let me tell you about my sister. Let's call her Tessa. She's been a constant source of stress in my life, like a storm cloud that never goes away. We've never seen eye to eye, not even as kids. She has this way of twisting situations to suit her and a tendency to act like the world revolves around her. My parents, bless their hearts, have always been overly protective of her, and I think that's where the problems began. Tessa was born prematurely, which seemed to flip some kind of switch in my parents. They became so focused on her that, well, I often felt like I was just there. They'd forget to show up for my school plays or basketball games, sometimes even leaving me stranded without a ride home. And birthdays? Those were another sore spot. While Tessa got these thoughtful gifts that lit up her world, I get things like books or stuffed animals that felt like an afterthought, stuff I didn't even like. It was like being cast in the shadow of my own sister, year after year. Now, dealing with my parents' favoritism was one thing, but Tessa? She took it to a whole new level. She thrived on it. She'd use their bias against me every chance she got. There was this one time, still burns me to this day, when she destroyed my favorite dress while I was asleep. Why? Because some guy she liked had asked me out instead of her. I was devastated. That dress meant a lot to me, and I couldn't stop crying when I found it in shreds. I told my parents, hoping for some justice, but Tessa turned on the waterworks. She claimed I was the one being cruel to her, that I'd gone after the guy on purpose just to hurt her. And somehow, my parents bought it. They told me to steer clear of guys she liked, to keep the peace. Can you believe that? It wasn't even my fault the guy liked me. Another time, I begged my parents to take me to Six Flags for my birthday. I'd been dreaming about it for weeks. I've always loved adventure. But Tessa caught wind of it and decided she wanted to go there for her birthday, too. Her birthday came first, so guess what? My parents took her. She barely rode any of the attractions. It was obvious she only wanted to ruin it for me. By the time my birthday rolled around, they said we couldn't go back because there's no point in visiting the same place twice in 1 year. Instead, we just went to our usual restaurant for dinner. I was crushed. As we got older, things didn't improve, they got worse. Tessa mastered the art of backhanded compliments. Your face looks better with glasses, she'd say, or I thought you were a lesbian, guess I was wrong. She had this way of making me feel small without even raising her voice. Unlike me, who preferred to stay under the radar, Tessa was the golden girl. She put on this perfect act for everyone else, kind, helpful, the life of the party, but behind closed doors, she was a nightmare. The only time she was nice to me was when she wanted something, and once she got it, she'd go right back to ignoring or mocking me. Her manipulations extended to my relationships, too. I had my first boyfriend when I was 17, and Tessa didn't waste a second sowing doubts in my mind. He's way too good looking for you, she'd say, he's gonna dump you eventually, so you might as well end it first. Whenever he came over, she'd cozy up to him, touching his arm and laughing way too hard at his jokes. It made him uncomfortable, and honestly, it made me question everything. After months of her little comments eating away at me, I broke up with him. Looking back, I feel awful about it. He was a good guy, and I let her get in my head. When I went off to college in another state to study engineering, I thought the distance would help. And it did, for a while. But every time I came home for the holidays, it was like stepping back into the same toxic atmosphere. Tessa hadn't changed. If anything, she'd sharpened her claws. By the time I was 25, she'd met Grant, the man she'd eventually marry. After dating for 2 years, she announced her engagement out of the blue. Honestly, we were all a little surprised since some of us knew she'd been seeing other guys on the side. Still, we were happy for her, at least she was settling down with a decent guy. Then came the kicker, she made me her maid of honor. My parents were thrilled, acting like it was the ultimate honor. Me? I felt like I'd been handed a grenade with the pin already pulled. Predictably, Tessa turned the whole thing into a power trip. She'd threatened to replace me if I didn't do things exactly the way she wanted. Anytime I offered an honest opinion, she'd explode, blaming me for ruining her vision and starting these ridiculous yelling matches. After a while, I just stopped giving my input altogether. It wasn't worth the drama. Keeping my head down seemed like the only way to survive. One time, during a lunch meeting about the wedding, I asked if the maid of honor would be wearing a different dress just to understand her plans better. She snapped, accusing me of making everything about myself and assuming I'd even still be in the role. Later, when we were talking about accommodations for out-of-town guests, my mom suggested booking Airbnbs early. I agreed, thinking it was a good idea, but Tessa flipped out again. She said she and Grant had already decided on hotels, and if we wanted Airbnbs, we'd have to arrange them ourselves. It was like walking on eggshells every time we spoke. After that, she kept laying into me, saying I didn't use my brain enough and scolding me like I was some kind of incompetent employee. "You're my maid of honor," she snapped, "and that basically means you work for me. You need to talk to me before agreeing with what anyone else says." I just shut down at that point, trying to de-escalate the situation. But that only made her angrier. She accused me of being negative and giving her attitude. My mom tried to step in, but Tessa cut her off, steamrolling the conversation. "I can't deal with an immature maid of honor like you," she ranted. "You need to do better." I didn't argue back, I just sat there quietly, hoping she'd run out of steam. Eventually, she decided it was time to leave. She was heading back to her apartment, and I was supposed to go home. But as we got into the car and sat in the parking lot, she started up again, rehashing the same grievances for another 10 minutes. All I could think about was how badly I wanted to escape, but my car was parked a good 20 minutes away, and I had no way out. Finally, the wedding day arrived. The ceremony itself went smoothly enough, but the reception? That was a different story. Tessa found every excuse to pick a fight with me over the smallest things. She'd yell at me in front of everyone, making the atmosphere tense and awkward. Whether it was the music playlist or the waitstaff not serving drinks fast enough, she'd glare at me like it was all somehow my fault. When it was time for me to give my speech, I stood up, hoping to share something heartfelt. I talked about her childhood, reminiscing about the moments that had shaped her into the person she was. Most of the guests seemed to enjoy it, and even our parents told me later that they thought it was sweet. But Tessa? She pulled me aside afterward and tore into me, accusing me of embarrassing her in front of her in-laws. I was crushed. It felt like no matter what I did, it was never enough for her. The morning after the wedding, as I finally had a moment to breathe, it hit me just how much stress I'd been under these past few months, all because of her. For the first time, I realized that Tessa had been the source of so much anxiety in my life, not just recently, but for as long as I could remember. I wished I'd had the courage to back out of being her maid of honor, but I knew my family would have turned it all back on me. Now that the ordeal was over, I could finally focus on myself and my career. A few months later, I met Joel. He was sweet, funny, and smart, everything I could have asked for. We started dating, and after about a year, we decided to move in together. My parents were happy for me, but of course, Tessa had to chime in with her unsolicited opinion. "He's such a nerd," she sneered. "What do you even see in him?" She dismissed him as a boring computer guy, not realizing he worked in IT and made 3 times what I did. Not that it mattered, I loved him for who he was, not for his paycheck. Her judgment didn't faze me. For once, I felt secure in my choice, and her words didn't have the power to shake me. But then, life threw me a curveball. At a family dinner, Tessa announced she was pregnant. At first, I was happy for her, but then she added, "I can't wait to see you as an aunt. I'm going to need a lot of help during this tough time." Her words sent a chill down my spine. She was a grown woman with a husband and supportive parents, yet she was already hinting that I'd be roped into babysitting her child. Here's the thing, I've never been a kid person. I've always felt disconnected from children and knew early on that I didn't want any of my own. So hearing her talk about needing my help made me feel cornered. I worked from home, and I could already see how she might use that to her advantage, dropping her child off whenever she wanted and expecting me to adjust. Tessa never respected boundaries, and I knew if I tried to set any, my parents would jump to her defense like they always did. When her baby arrived, I found myself babysitting occasionally. At first, it wasn't too bad. Her husband worked the night shift, and she had a day job, so I'd watch the baby while he grabbed a few hours of sleep. The baby was 6 months old by the time I started, which made things a bit easier. But occasionally soon turned into frequently, and before I knew it, I was babysitting way more than I'd signed up for. And let me tell you, Tessa wasn't exactly grateful. She'd criticize everything I did, from how I changed the diapers to how I fed the baby. It didn't matter that I was doing her a favor, she always found something to nitpick. I'd be in the middle of working when I'd get a call from her or my mom. If I mentioned having no plans that weekend, they'd decide on my behalf that I'd be spending it at Tessa's house so she could take a break. It was like having a second job, except I wasn't getting paid for it. The worst part? After I'd spent the weekend helping out, Tessa would call my mom to complain about me. She'd nitpick every little thing, claiming I wasn't doing it right. It drove me crazy. I was going out of my way to help her, and instead of appreciating it, she was straining our relationship even more. Do you see how manipulative she was? She'd smile to my face and thank me, only to turn around and tear me down behind my back. After that, I hit my breaking point. Everything Tessa had been doing started to affect my mental health, and Joel noticed it too. One evening, we sat down to talk, and I completely broke down. I poured out everything I'd been holding in, and he listened patiently. When I finished, he urged me to stand up for myself and stop letting my family walk all over me. The next time I was called up for babysitting duties, I flat out refused. No excuses, no explanations, I just said no. Tessa and my mom called me repeatedly, guilt-tripping me with phrases like, "Do it for family," but I held firm. I told them I'd had enough and, frankly, they could go to hell. I wanted nothing to do with Tessa or her child anymore. After that, I stopped all contact with Tessa. She tried everything, calling, texting, even showing up at my door, but I wouldn't budge. I refused to let her back into my life. My parents tried to intervene, pressuring me to forgive her, but even they eventually gave up when they realized I wasn't going to cave. I kept minimal contact with them, only speaking occasionally. This went on for 2 years. During that time, Tessa went on to have another child with Grant, but things in her life took a sharp downward spiral. Last year, my mom called to tell me that Tessa and Grant were getting divorced. I was shocked, even though I didn't want anything to do with her. Curiosity got the better of me, and when I pressed for details, my mom spilled everything. Apparently, Grant had discovered that Tessa had been cheating on him with her co-workers. He found incriminating messages on a second phone she'd been hiding. Grant wasn't the type to make a scene, instead, he quietly gathered evidence, talked to a lawyer, and blindsided her with divorce papers. When she tried to explain herself, he shut her down, saying he knew everything. Tessa begged him to forgive her, but Grant was done. Honestly, looking back, Grant was way too good for her. I wasn't exactly happy about the situation, but I wasn't sad either. If anything, I was relieved he got out of the mess. After the divorce, Tessa had to move back in with our parents. From what I heard, her behavior only got worse. My parents would complain about how she'd stay out all night, come home in the early morning drunk and reeking of booze. Eventually, she was fired from her job for constantly showing up late. With no job and no accountability, Tessa started drinking even more. My parents were left to care for her children while she partied. This went on for months. Meanwhile, my life was going in the opposite direction. Joel and I adopted a dog, a sweet, goofy pup we both adore, and became proud pet parents. We even bought a house together, both our names on the deed. It felt like a fresh start, building a home together. Marriage was on the table, but we weren't in a rush. We knew we'd be in each other's lives forever, so we decided to take our time. When we hosted our housewarming party, I invited my parents, of course. Unfortunately, they took it upon themselves to bring Tessa and her kids without telling me. The moment I saw her walk in, I was furious. But I didn't want to cause a scene in front of everyone, so I held my tongue. Joel, ever the gracious host, welcomed them in and served drinks while I shot daggers at my parents. My dad sheepishly pulled me aside and admitted it wasn't his idea. "Your mother thought this would be the perfect time for you and Tessa to reconcile," he mumbled. Tessa, oblivious to the tension, loudly instructed her kids to give me a hug. I forced a polite smile as they wrapped their little arms around me. Then she started lecturing me, saying I should be a more involved aunt because the kids hardly recognize you. I was grinding my teeth to keep from snapping back. Throughout the party, Tessa was glued to her wine glass. She didn't seem to care what her kids were up to as they wreaked havoc in our home. They chased after our dog, trying to kick him and pull his tail. They kept trying to get into our bedroom, which I deliberately closed off, and even managed to break a vase while roughhousing. I kept glancing at Tessa, hoping she'd step in and say something, but she was too busy laughing and drinking with other guests. When some people asked for a house tour, Tessa tagged along, uninvited. As we walked through the house, she made loud, snide comments. When we got to the backyard, she declared, "This place is way too big for just 2 people, then smirked and asked, "So, when are you planning to have kids?" Her question immediately piqued the curiosity of the other guests, who all turned to look at me. I shut her down on the spot, saying, "That's none of your business." Tessa shot back, "Your life choices are everyone's concern, especially since you're an aunt." I could feel my frustration boiling over, but I kept my composure for the sake of the party. As the evening went on, Tessa only got drunker. Her remarks turned more personal, and she started making inappropriate comments about my relationship with Joel. She implied we were wasting our time by not getting married and having kids, making everyone around us visibly uncomfortable. Once most of the guests had left, I decided I'd had enough. I pulled Tessa aside and confronted her. I told her how disappointed I was in her behavior, especially given our history. Predictably, she didn't take it well. She accused me of being stuck up and ungrateful, claiming I owed her for all the times she supposedly babysat me as a kid. After the fiasco at my housewarming party, I thought I'd finally drawn the line. My parents, as always, tried to mediate. My mother urged me yet again to forgive Tessa, but I stood firm. I told them I wasn't budging and asked them all to leave. That incident left a sour taste in my mouth, and I resolved to cut off all contact with Tessa and my mother, who seemed determined to keep enabling her behavior. For a while, I thought I was finally free of the drama. If I stayed out of their lives, they'd stay out of mine, simple. But yesterday morning, there was an unexpected knock on my door. When I opened it, there stood Tessa, looking frantic and desperate. She wasted no time launching into her story. She claimed she had an emergency at work and couldn't find anyone else to watch her kids. She begged me to help, promising it would only be for a few hours. I looked down at her kids. They were sleepy, their little faces tired from being dragged out so early. My heart broke for them. I asked her why she couldn't call our parents. She said they were at our aunt's place and even told me I could verify it, which I later did. Then I asked about Grant, their dad. She said he wasn't picking up because he'd worked a night shift and was still sleeping. With no other options and feeling a twinge of guilt, I begrudgingly agreed to look after the kids. Tessa didn't waste a second. She practically ran out the door, thanking me as she went. As I closed the door behind her, a mix of frustration and empathy churned in my chest. I couldn't believe her audacity, dumping her kids on me without any notice or consideration for my plans. Still, I reminded myself it wasn't the kids' fault, and I decided to make the best of the situation. We played games, watched cartoons, and even dabbled in some arts and crafts. To my surprise, they warmed up to me quickly, and their behavior became much more manageable. I started to enjoy their company despite my frustration with their mother. When lunchtime rolled around, I realized I had no idea if they had any food allergies. I couldn't risk it, so I tried calling Tessa to check. No answer. I tried again later, but it went straight to voicemail. Annoyed, I decided to gently ask the kids directly. "Do you have any allergies or foods you don't like?" I asked. The older one hesitated before answering. "Mom doesn't like us eating peanuts," she said. Then, as if by accident, she added, "Maybe she's busy at the wedding." I froze. Wedding? What wedding? She looked nervous, then admitted she'd overheard Tessa talking about it with a friend on the drive over. That was when everything clicked. My blood began to boil. I thanked the kids for their honesty and reassured them everything was fine. Then I stepped into the other room and called my parents. After some coaxing, my mom finally came clean. Tessa hadn't gone to work, she was at a wedding. And not just any wedding, but a child-free one she attended with her new boyfriend. To top it off, the boyfriend had no idea she was a mother of two. My mom tried to justify Tessa's actions, saying, "You know how hard it is for single mothers. Men don't like dating women with kids." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Tessa had lied to me, manipulated me, and once again exploited my willingness to help. Furious, I checked her Instagram. Sure enough, there were fresh stories from the wedding. There she was, smiling, drinking, and pretending her kids didn't even exist. Not a single photo or mention of them anywhere on her profile. By the time Tessa came back to pick up her kids, I was fuming. We had a huge argument right there at the door. I told her I was done with her lies and manipulation. I made it clear that if she ever tried to dump her kids on me again, I'd involve Child Protective Services. Tessa didn't take it well. She started yelling and hurling insults, calling me ungrateful and selfish. That's when Joel walked in. Freshly home from work, he quickly assessed the situation and stepped in. Calm but firm, he told Tessa to leave or he'd call the police. That shut her up. She stormed off with the kids, slamming the door on her way out. The whole ordeal left me drained and emotionally exhausted. I was grateful to have Joel by my side, but the fallout didn't stop there. My mother and aunt both reached out to scold me for not being more understanding. "You need to be more sympathetic to Tessa's struggles," they said. "Family helps family in times of need." But where was that same energy when I needed support? This morning, I reflected on everything, and the truth hit me hard: my mom is toxic. She's always favored Tessa, no matter how much chaos my sister causes. It's unfair, and I've decided I need to confront her about it. I called my aunt first to get her side of the story. Turns out my mom hadn't told her the full truth about what happened. When I filled her in, including how Tessa lied about going to a wedding and hid her kids from her boyfriend, my aunt was shocked. She apologized to me and promised to speak to my mom about it. At this point, I feel a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I'm finally standing up for myself, but sadness that my family has let things get to this point. Still, I know one thing for sure: I'm done being the family doormat. Not long after I spoke to my aunt, my mom sent me a text. She wasn't happy, accusing me of involving others in family matters and throwing Tessa under the bus. It was exhausting to see her bending over backward yet again to justify Tessa's behavior. No matter what my sister did, my mom always found a way to defend her, never holding her accountable. Update 2: It's been 2 weeks since my last update, and despite my best efforts to distance myself, the family tension hasn't let up. My mom has been relentless, urging me to forgive Tessa and babysit her kids whenever Tessa asks. She's even resorted to emotional blackmail, telling me that she and my dad are getting older and that Tessa will be the only family I'll have left someday. I decided it was time for an honest conversation. I asked to meet my mom one-on-one and made it clear I didn't want Tessa brought up during the discussion. She agreed, and we met at a quiet cafe. As we sat down, I took a deep breath and began. I told her how much I loved her and Dad, and how I wanted to maintain a healthy relationship with them. I acknowledged her concerns about family and aging but made it clear that my well-being needed to come first. I laid it all out: the emotional toll Tessa's manipulations had taken on me, the years of being overlooked, and the resentment I felt. I explained that in order for me to have any kind of peace, I needed space. My mom listened quietly, and I could see a mix of guilt and realization on her face. Then, after a pause, she admitted something I didn't expect. She said she'd always been aware of Tessa's manipulative behavior but chose to ignore it. When Tessa was born prematurely with health complications, my mom was terrified. She became overprotective, and that fear turned into blind favoritism. Hearing that broke my heart. I told her I understood her fear back then, but I reminded her that I was her child, too. Just because I was born healthy didn't mean I didn't need her love and attention. I pointed out that her enabling Tessa had created a cycle that not only hurt me but would likely hurt Tessa's kids as well. I urged her to talk to Tessa and help her grow up before her own children started resenting her the way I did. For the first time, I felt like my words truly hit home. My mom nodded, seeming genuinely thoughtful, and said she'd think about everything I said. The conversation ended with her pleading for reassurance. She asked me not to cut her off entirely, saying she regretted the pain she'd caused me. I promised her I wouldn't disappear but explained that I needed some time apart to heal. Later, my dad reached out separately. He told me he understood my decision and even admitted he regretted enabling Tessa over the years. He said he respected my need to prioritize my mental health and promised to be there for me whenever I needed him. Hearing that from him meant the world to me. As for Tessa, I've cut off all contact with her. I even installed cameras at my door, so if she tries pulling any stunts again, I'll have evidence to take legal action. Update 3. It's been 4 months since my last update, and I've been intentionally offline during that time. Stepping away from social media has been one of the best decisions I've ever made. My mental health has improved significantly, and I've been focusing on therapy and personal growth. The biggest news? Joel proposed. It happened during a romantic beach date. Seeing him nervously drop to one knee and pull out a ring was the sweetest moment of my life. I said yes, of course, and we're planning the wedding for a few months from now. I can't believe I get to marry this wonderful man who stood by me through everything. I told my parents about the engagement, though we don't talk much. They're thrilled for me and adore Joel, which is a relief. As for Tessa, she's finally moved out of my parents' house. Apparently, she pushed them too far by staying out late partying and drinking. They gave her an ultimatum, and when she refused to change, they told her she had to leave. My parents even offered to cover 6 months of her rent to help her get on her feet. After that, she's on her own. From what I've heard, she's still getting child support from Grant, but I doubt it's enough to cover her own personal expenses. I can only hope she'll take this as a wake-up call and start being responsible for her sake and her kids. As for me, I'm finally at peace. I'm building a life I'm proud of, with Joel by my side and a focus on my own happiness. It's been a long journey, but I finally feel like I'm moving forward.